we go. Thanks for everybody for coming. As a reminder, so for the audience, for questions, it's relatively small. But if you do have a question and you can't project well enough, the microphones, you can get to the microphone or ask for someone to pass it to you. For the folks in the back especially, so they can hear you up front. It's my pleasure to reintroduce Rajeev Parekh. I've called him doctor yesterday, and I'd like to confer upon all of you a doctorate of something, so there's the power vested in me. But welcome back to the stage as he's going to moderate this esteemed panel. As you know, we were here yesterday, and Rajeev Parekh, who's the portfolio director at MITRE Corporation, provided a keynote presentation on the evolution of federation and coalition interoperability. Today he joins us again to lead a panel discussing approaches to federation, domain standards, and methods, and he'll introduce his panel members. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Parekh.
Thank you. So I wanted to kind of set the scope for this this panel session in that I'm looking at these approaches. So from the presentation we had yesterday, we talked about like the past and the present, and now really this panel discussion is really about the future, where we want to go and how we want to approach that. As you heard from Colonel Genovi as well as Admiral Davidson and the various presentations and panels yesterday, there are various aspects that we have to deal with in coalition and federation as well. And those things to be able to federate could include things like culture, mission, need, partner capability, et cetera. And so I really think there's a wide scope here, and this discussion about the approaches to federations, we want to be able to kind of encompass that wide scope and where we want to go into the future. So, and as Dick mentioned, this is an interactive panel session. So we encourage questions, and it's absolutely desired for us. I have one disclaimer, like I did yesterday. So the views, the opinions, and the discussions of this panel should not be construed as official government, whether it's U.S. or others, or corporate positions unless designated by other documentation. So this way we can talk freely and really to spawn ideas and thoughts on how we want to move together in the future. So let me start by introducing the panel members. On my right, all the way on the right, is Joe Carson. He had the last presentation of the day yesterday. He's the Chief Security, oh man, I can't read my own writing. Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO for Thycotic. And that's actually a better way to do it. So, Chief Security Scientist for Thycotic. We don't have Amir Dasturi here. Unfortunately, he was unable to make it, but Mr. Ian Stewart from the National Security Agency, he is the Division Director for Identity, Credentialing, and Access Management, took his place and will be able to answer questions about the IC and how we're doing IC credentialing and kind of, and I said the U.S. intelligence community, excuse me, I speak in acronyms. And partners and allies were in the U.S. intelligence community and how we work intelligence credentialing in that aspect. We have, to my left, Colonel Whitney McCloud, United States Air Force. He's the Director and the Commanding Officer of the Joint Spectrum Center at the Defense Information Systems Agency. So from a different perspective, we're looking at electromagnetic spectrum, and he will be able to help answer some of those questions of how we federate that kind of perspective on the transmission systems, but also on electromagnetic spectrum usage. And lastly, we've got Mr. Roger Westman, a Principal Cybersecurity Engineer at the MITRE Corporation, and he has a background in integrity, credential, data tagging, digital rights management, and advises various senior government forums on those topics as well as cybersecurity. So with that, we can start off with some of the questions and concerns, and I've got a question already prepared and ready to go for this. And one of the key things that we talked about yesterday was security and federation. Is there a way that we can actually work security and federation? So my question to the panel, I'll start off with Joe, would be security and federation seem like they're at odds with each other. Can we have federated security? And what does that really mean? And how do we approach that? So I'll start off with Joe.
Sure, absolutely. I think absolutely in today's world, security and federation has a lot of conflicting approaches. One of the reasons for it is that a lot of the laws and regulations actually conflict against each other, which actually prevents some of the security measures and the ability to move forward. So each country will have its own interpretation and regulations and policies that they enforce for their own security measures. And when we look at interoperability between nation states, a lot of those regulations, laws sometimes conflict and prevent a lot of those interoperability in projects moving forward. So one of the things we have to really look at is, one is how we make sure that from a legal perspective, when we're doing interoperability should be bound by the legal realms of the world. Is that where you can actually do those binding agreements or policies. That was actually one of the reasons for the EU GDPR, was to make sure that across EU countries that there was actually consistent regulation that actually applied cybersecurity and protection of privacy and information across EU countries. So one of the things we have to make sure as we're moving forward interoperability, that actually the rule of law and legal and policies and binding agreements must be updated, must be ratified to make sure that they're actually able to support the interoperability and security going forward. And to be able to do that, we also must combine that with a risk framework. A risk model must also be able to look at to make sure that we have and understand the risks of those interoperability agreements, and the risk must be aligned to the law and legal side of things. So that's some of the things we need to look for, is to make sure that both we have the capability of security supporting a federated model, and it must be undermined and related to the legal and regulations that support it.
Thank you. Roger or Colonel McCloud, Ian, have anything else to add?
Yeah, so look, I'm going to go drive into something very specific just because I like to provoke if I can. My organization not just does ICAM services for our own organization and for the Intel community, but we also do, I guess I can call it consulting. And we've had outreach to various DoD organizations, to include some of those doing mission partner environment kind of activities. And I have been leading some discussions with some of these folks in MPE regarding PKI, okay? And I start from a different perspective than some when it comes to how to do this in a federated environment. You know, if you go to some people, they're going to start with the policy. The policy says, I start with what's your problem, and then I go from there. And in this case, as I listen and learn about the problem space and the environment of concern, in this case, it's on a secret fabric, the NSS PKI should not be the one that's relied on, and in fact, a distinct PKI should be established, and go from there. And then, as you start to do more discovery on the problem and the environment, and you determine, okay, I'm going to do a specific PKI for this environment, then you start to layer in, you encumber the problem with some of the reality. What are the actual policies in play? And so I have some policy people that, of course, hit the ceiling right away, and then and that's actually a good activity, because part of my ongoing discussion is how can I bring them back off the ceiling? And it engages a good discussion. What are the policies? What are the conflicts with the policies that are in place? And again, I'm focusing on secret right now. And in this case for PKI, CNSSD 506, which says on secret, you shall use the NSS PKI. And I'm stating that in this case, the NSS PKI should not apply, because it is just a bridge too far. You have distinct separate environment. It's a case for internal PKI, not the NSS PKI, because if you look at the certificate policy for NSS PKI, there's a number of things that'll be hard to achieve, really hard to achieve. And in fact, looking at it the other way, it'll be hard to reach out to the various factors of NSS PKI within a mission partner environment to actually leverage the service and do certificates and so forth. So I just throw that out to kind of provoke a conversation on that, if that has provoked anybody, because it is just conversation at this point, but you have to get started as well. You can't just keep doing a discussion on a problem. You have to start somewhere. Come out with an idea, which is essentially makes yourself a dartboard, let people throw darts, and maybe we learn and grow from there, and we can implement sooner.
So, do you have some?
I do.
Yes.
So, you know, from my perspective, and I like that because that's the title of my brief later on this afternoon, is that, you know, data is the new currency. and EMS is its broker. You know, so for every sovereign nation out there, there is already spectrum set up. So when we talk about policies and things of that nature, you know, that's the art and science of it. But for each, from where I sit, and even as I look at this carpet right here, you know, there is not a melting pot of how each country does their data and their protection. It's more of a mosaic. So if you look hard enough, or actually not even hard enough, you can see the pattern within that. Now, once you have that pattern, then again, the art and sciences of decoupling what one country can do versus another country can do, how they slice up their data, how they, you know, appropriate that data, or how you appropriate that data, that's where it gets into the complications of things, right? So I really hit it from that perspective to the fact that regardless of how you secure the data, it has to go through a medium. And it's sort of like air. There's an assumption that when you get up and you do this, you're going to have air. Well, there's an assumption that even though you have all these secure practices and things of that nature, the medium through which you have that security is always going to be available, and I can tell you that it's not.
Now, I'd like to just inquire a little bit more about the EMS perspective, because I know you've been attending a lot of the sessions that have been happening in Coalition Interoperability Forum. Do you feel that the EMS spectrum has had the same type of attention as some of the networking aspects, or do you think it needs more attention? And if so, why?
No, it's again, the EMS or the spectrum has been, it's been a niche community. You know, it's those individuals behind the curtain that's been doing a lot of things. You know, I would equate it to this. A Faraday cage. A Faraday cage, it is designed such that electromagnetic images can't penetrate that. However, here's the secret. If there is something inside that Faraday cage that has an unshielded wire, it is emitting a signal. And it's inside that Faraday cage, you have your secure data, and you feel that it's very secure, but it's now in an open environment. Guess what? It becomes vulnerable. So when we talk about federation, there is all the parts and pieces that have to go in line, and we talk about trust and what level of trust, what level of risk that's associated with that. From a spectrum standpoint, if I was to ask anyone in this room, what is their digital footprint? What does it look like? You can probably give me a pretty good idea of that. But if I was to ask you, what is your EMS footprint? You'll probably be hard-pressed to give me that. Yet, everyone in here is emanating something, because who in here does not have a cell phone? Right? That's the level of assumption that goes into, yes, it's secure. I don't need to know how you have it secure, but if I know that's important to you, I can deny that to you. And all I need to know is to deny it to you for a split second, whatever the case would be, from a operational standpoint. So yes, it's being overlooked because one, it's being relegated to maybe just electronic warfare, which is a part of the overall umbrella, which is the electromagnetic spectrum.
So from your perspective as commander of the Defense Spectrum Center, how do we work that with other nations? Because this is a real challenge from a security standpoint, EMS security.
Oh,
how
absolutely.
do we work that?
I mean, there's multiple organizations. You have the, right now we have a bunch of folks that's in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, going over, you know, how, from an international standpoint, we regulate who uses the spectrum, how that spectrum is used, because everything has a spectrum-dependent system side to it. And so, you know, some of the principles are like this. So when you go to another country and you take your respective laptop or whatever the case may be, you don't worry whether or not, you know, you have to have that power supply. Either that, you know, your power supply will automatically convert it to whatever that particular thing is, or you have to put some adapter on the end. Yet we go out and we buy systems that are fixed on a certain frequency, and we expect that that frequency is going to be available when we go to that next country. Industry, if they're out there, needs to probably produce something that gives that ability to flip a switch that can go and actually use that, and that will help with some of the, you know, identity issues that we have forward. So from my standpoint, that's what we're trying to do. We're evolving, one, getting that niche community and sort of explaining to folks in simple terms, not to be insulting, but in simple terms, this is why it's important. This is why, you know, the 2.5 gigahertz that you like to use is less prominent than the 5 gigahertz that you're using, which where we're going with the 5G. So it can be it can get real complicated real quick. So you have to bring it back and explain that to folks that, okay, have you considered this? And from an operational standpoint, you need to understand how you look to yourself, how you look to others, and how to protect that, or how to allow that to switch as we go from one medium or one location from an international standpoint. And each country, as I say again, has their own sovereign right, and they treat their spectrum a little bit different. So you have to be in the knowledge, you have to understand that, and again, lexicon matters.
Absolutely, and I agree with that. So this is a nice segue into discussion about standards. And, oh, would you okay.
So we'll talk about lexicon for a second. And I didn't tell Colonel McCloud. When he said EMS, for some of us, it means entitlement management system. So when I go back to the office, I get to have some fun with a program manager about that. And she'll blow her top until I tell her it's about electromagnetic spectrum. But as we're all talking, and Colonel McCloud's think about operations, deployments, you talked about trust. Ian talked about IT challenges. To me, the EMS is an IT type challenge. The one thing we forget when we're doing interoperability with our partners is, what is the mission we're trying to do? Humanitarian relief, you're just going in, deploy things, tracking some people as an example. That's one thing. If you're building an integrated pipeline where you have partners sitting inside your air operations center or some other cyber center, and they're integrated into your business, and your entire collection pipeline, analysis pipeline, and dissemination pipelines are fully integrated, that's one type of mission that is completely different if I'm just broadcasting a final report out. Those subtleties are important to understand from a trust point of view, an IT point of view, and all those other little things. So saying you're going to work multi-partner engagement, multi-partner environments, you have to understand which piece are we doing. Are we doing the complete integrated pipeline with fully trusted partners, others that you come in but you say you can only go into that room and you're going to log into those types of systems, or your system is feeding data in and it may not be in the right format because those partners may not be as mature from a trust point of view, legal framework point of view, an IT point of view, and a mission point of view. And those are the things that impact the applications. JEDI is going to give us a great infrastructure. We can handle those, but it's those applications that we deploy have to assume flexibility from an ICAM point of view, up to a point. Can't do infinite options, obviously, but it does come into play about which specific type of missions. We can rehost a lot of things. It's all IT after a while, but understand how that impacts it. I don't have it. For all of us who carry MFA tokens around our neck, we know we don't want more than 3. Our necks can't handle it. So when they go, oh, you're going to have a token for this, a token for that, a token for that, most of us get very unhappy quickly. I like my user ID and password for that reason, but I don't like user ID and passwords anymore because I don't want to remember 36 characters anymore. I'm getting old. I can't do this anymore.
Only 36?
Only 36 for one system.
Okay.
The other ones do MFA, thank God.
Yeah, I just also want to add to it, just to give a bit of more of a use case and an industry's perspective. So one that I've had experience with in the past was where all of these legal frameworks and IT challenges all come together. Estonia, a number of years ago, introduced what was called the e-residency program, or e-identity. And that enabled Estonia to provide, where it used to provide digital services for all of its own citizens. It expanded that to all citizens around the world. So they offered their e-residency, so anyone here in this room could go to and obtain an e-residency. Even current US presidents and former presidents are all e-residents of Estonia. And what happened is that they realized in order to actually make it more valuable, they needed to have those identities being able to use the banking services in Estonia, because the banking is really what does investment, engages businesses. So they decided to go through this requirement and project to create what was called this open banking system, the number about 4 or 5 years ago. And this was to enable all those e-residency to open bank accounts that allowed them to actually create businesses within the EU zone and then provide services across the EU to all different countries. That was all great, and everything was going well. And then what happened was, then we found out there was actually significant fraud happening within those banking systems. And the fraud's, it's still ongoing today. A lot of the banks are having still major challenges because of those fraudulent activities. What we found is that because of that lack of oversight and lack of visibility into the realm of law and legal boundaries, a lot of the e-residence accounts are opened up in places like Indonesia were actually legally opened and legally created by authentic citizens. But those citizens, because there was no boundaries and no ramifications for them going and selling those accounts off to actually fraudulent criminals, those criminals started using it for fraudulent activities. And it meant that because of those boundaries, Estonia could not prosecute or could not bring any legal ramifications to those people that was using those accounts because it was outside their legal boundaries. And what ended up as a result, what happened was the central bank said that all of those accounts that was created through that same system and same process were now high-risk accounts. And the banks now had to provide much more monetary coverage and insurance coverage for those accounts. And it was too much for the banks to take, so they actually had to cancel all e-residency open accounts all at the same time, and then go through a process of re-engaging again. So one of the things you can see a use case where they decided to create a system where it was beyond borders in order for a good purpose, but because those legal boundaries was foreseen, what they should have done was where they had within the EU or within US or within countries where they had legal agreements existing, that should have been the places where they had a higher trust and a higher ability to give those open banking accounts. But in places where countries, that should have been done on a much more higher risk perspective and looked at it from a more granular way to make sure that they had existing legal agreements before they opened up bank accounts. So we had to make sure that all of these work together, and that's a use case where a system failed because of that lack of oversight and lack of visibility into the legal boundaries.
Ah, a very good point. And so did that result in either the legal framework changing or standards being in place so that they can actually then talk with a common lexicon, as Roger mentioned, to other nations?
It has meant that the vision has become much more focused at places where existing frameworks exist and existing standards where exist, rather than thinking that the world is now, has the same rules and applies everywhere. It now focuses more where the rules apply the same. So it did mean that the focus became much more narrow and it allowed it to reinvent itself. And then it's now actually going through a second stage of figuring out how it recovers from that failure.
I understand. Any questions from the audience so far? That would be a no. I want to come circling back around to you, Ian, about the public key infrastructure and the standards and that type of thing and discussing this type of thing. I wanted to kind of push a little bit further on your, I guess, provocative point, is that when you have public key infrastructure and being able to establish some of that stuff with other nations and being able to, how do you enable the trust or the reciprocal action, the mutual authentication or the mutual trust between that? And are there thoughts from your perspective from working within sometimes U.S. intelligence community, which can almost act like individual nations themselves? So,
Yeah, so the U.S. intel community has essentially been working two federations forever. There is the U.S. intel community, which itself has been a federation for a very long time.
Yeah.
And then we work with our Five Eyes partners. But even there, we're working with them at two levels. NSA is a signals intelligence agency, works with our Five Eyes signals intelligence agencies. But these days, we also have Five Eyes Enterprise, which is the 5 intel communities. So now you have the PKIs associated kind of federations even with each one of those. It becomes layers, essentially.
Yeah.
Or maybe it just expands is what it does. But yeah, federation is not hard. It takes constant work. It takes governance is what it takes. With federation does come governance. You have to be working with your partners constantly. It's not we meet once, we make an agreement and we go away. You're meeting for as long as the Federation stands, to understand what are the kinds of assurance levels we have to meet and continue to meet, and the nuts and bolts. Trust exchange, okay? I've agreed to trust your infrastructure, your trusts. You agree to trust my trusts. But then it becomes more than that. Then, you know, anyone that has an application that has to process certificates knows that it's more than just trust, it's revocation status checking, which brings even more hard work into it. How do you achieve it, particularly with other sovereign partners? And again, the US Intel community can look like a bunch of separate domains, possibly with boundary controls between them, just as we may have with our foreign partners. And so you have to work those measures as well as part of a federation. Despite the fact that you're using these standards-based things, PKI is no mystery. It's all standards-based, and the processes involved are standards-based with standards or standard applications that can process certificates. It is quite a bit of work constantly to maintain.
Thank you.
Let me add something to that. Ian was talking about a very specific technical capability. In the journey, you know, we did a network, identity base, now we're doing data centricity, and some of us are going past that now and everything, working on next-gen capabilities that we need to keep evolving because the mission keeps changing and oversight and compliance rules keep changing, the need to be flexible and everything. But each one of those agreements, you may be working with your partners for 50, 70 years, depending on how you trace back your history of your organization, but certain things are major political events. When you form certain ICAM trusts, IT people are happy, of course, you go out to a pub and have a drink with your counterparts to celebrate, but it becomes a major political recognition, and the seniors may formally celebrate that, of course, because it shows the maturity of different organizations working together. That doesn't mean all organizations are the same. The U.S. usually is the big gorilla on the block. You respect all partners the same. And so you work together to help everybody evolve. And sometimes it is saying, look, how you're doing it, we understand why you did it, but it may be suboptimal in the long run, and please evolve. Or they may come up with, because of changeover of staff, by going, hey, the internet is doing it this way, why aren't you? And you have to have those discussions because you have to evolve. We know PKI will not be the sole authenticator for humans, carbon-based life forms, forever. People want to try different things. Us in the DoD with our CAC cards, we understand that. When you're in a chem bio suit in the middle of the desert, you can't do your CAC. You can't do an RSA token. You got to do something to get mission done. And that's what I was talking about earlier about which specific mission thread are you supporting. So it's a constant evolution, and it's a constant growing and maturing of different organizations. And every time you bring one on, you may have to, you feel like you're starting over, but it gives you a chance to rethink and revalidate what you're doing. So I'll be quiet, sorry.
Thank you, Roger.
I'm Bob Abramson with MITRE. I think PKI is a great example to use to discuss the Federation because it's a case where the Federation extends all the way down to the individual users. So, for example, I have to keep my PKI certs up to date, have them installed properly, and we all know what happens when your certs aren't working right or you're trying to get them properly installed and you're dealing with help desks and whether it's just simple email applications or other authentication types of scenarios, could be on just your corporate network, where hopefully it's pretty straightforward and standardized across the whole corporation. You could be working across, MITRE, we're trying to send emails to a certain government agency. Our certs may be incompatible. Or on, other, customer networks, you may find similar situations. So I guess the crux of the question is, from the service provider standpoint that I think most of you are viewing this from, how can we move towards services that end users can more effectively leverage and comply with? Because the point of PKI is to add that additional level of protection, let's say on my messages going here, there, other, so that third party, even if they're looking at all that data, they can't read the information. I know some people in certain parts of our corporation are told, PKI everything. Just make it just a standard practice, right? So I've got a long distribution list, and I'm getting an error saying this one guy or this one gal's cert, just won't come back. I take them off the list, or I just say, well, I'll send it unencrypted. Is it really, how important is it to use that PKI protection for that particular set of information? So in reality, the security and protection, if you don't have end users able to engage and comply in an effective way, a lot of what you do is undermined. So I'm not a technologist in this area. I'm a chief scientist at MITRE, but I'm more, on the mission side. I'd be curious from the panelists, what may be on the horizon? Are there emerging standards, new approaches that will address these issues, or any other kind of, sage advice you can give us? Thank you.
I'll start with Joe.
Sure. I mean, I can give it from the perspective of my experience in Estonia, is that what we've moved towards is really allowing, from a PKI perspective, is that we've moved to mainly separating a microservices and identity across the board. So trying to microsegment every piece. So from identifiers to the assertion of who I am, to how do I verify and authenticate to systems, and then what I can do in order to then have a higher authentication for change. So what we've ended up doing is really separating each of those components so that the user can manage it themselves without having to rely on a central party. And this really means that, for example, I have an identity card, which is assigned by the Estonian government, that has a validity of 5 years. And those certificates get regenerated every 2 years. But what I can use that card for is I can use that card to actually provision other devices or other identities, meaning my mobile ID. So I can actually use the identity card, which has actual 5 certificates based on the actual ID card itself. And I can get a mobile ID, which also then I can create as a child off that identity card, and now put that card in my pocket and use my mobile phone. So what it means is what you're really doing is making a mechanism that allows the user to have control over their identity. It means that I can actually provision other devices and still trust and create that trust. But what happens is you're separating the who I am to the authentication, but also keeping the country has the control over privileges. I don't have control over privileges. I have control over the who I am and how I verify myself, but I've actually separated completely the privileges side of things. And that's where we really need to get to, and it's continuous, meaning every time something changes or every time I need to go and the risk increases, I need to re-verify myself. And if I want that, one is I can read data versus change data as well. But it means that I'm more in control. I have more visibility and transparency. But it means that we have complete separation of every piece of micro-segmentation of the identity itself to what the user can control versus what the company or country can control. It means it's much more flexible. It's not perfect. We've had issues along the way where a few years ago we had a vulnerability in the algorithm we were using for the identity cards, which meant that we had to go and update certain cards. So there is challenges by doing that model, and it means that, of course, it does impact the end users or the citizens or the employees at some point in time. But it is a much more risk-focused approach that allows separation of those duties or controls.
Yeah, so when we're talking federation, right, there's that the elephant in the room. What is your respective capability maturity model? How do you get a seat at the table? How do you plug in? Where is that sweet spot, if you would, that for the respective countries, and you come to a consensus of the sense that, all right, in order for you to have a degree of trust where we can exchange, you have to be at this level. And whatever that level is, has to be something that is pretty much codified It can be dynamic, but it has to be codified. How does a respective country, depending on where they're at under their capability, how do they plug in? And in order to plug in, say, with Estonia, or in order to plug in with, whatever country, you have to be at this level. So until you're at that level, then this is the level of trust that we will have with you, and vice versa.
Correct.
And that is the crux of it. How do you go from where you are, get to where you need to be? And you need to have a standard or some type of architecture that says, in order for me to, walk into this building, I have to have a certain degree of credentials, and how do I get that? So that is the mechanisms to walk, crawl, whatever the case may be, in order to get there. And so the level of PKI and things of that nature, well, what is that standard? And how do I get there? How do I get that information or distribute that information to that one person who either didn't keep up their credentials or maybe are not at that capability maturity model level in order to maintain that? And so the art and science of that is, a lot of people are doing a lot of great things.
I've seen that, going to your point, I've seen challenges where other countries have wanted to use the same mechanism that Estonia had. And you get into where actually not every employee had smartphones. So then you had to think about, well, how do I, and then in some countries it was actually legal for them to have ID cards because they found some old law back in the 1800s about having some type of biometric on a card that prevent them from having ID cards. So you do have to look at everything from the perspective of the maturity of those countries or states or even organizations to what is their maturity, what do they have to bring. It goes back to one of the points I was talking in one of the panels yesterday about where we do see the future going is people will bring their own identity. What I'm going to do is give them authorization authentication that plugs that in. So your point, absolutely, different maturity models, different countries will have different capabilities, but we need to find something, the Federation, that allows us to choose different risks based on those different maturities.
Yeah, and I just want to also say that, you picked the absolute worst application or protocol to with that question, SMIME, encryption of email. As far as I'm concerned, everywhere I see the use of email encryption that involves more than one specific, I'll say, Active Directory domain, email encryption is a disaster. We're still in the Stone Ages as far as I'm concerned. So I would like to see that in the future we reduce reliance on email for information exchange among individuals. I do know that I'm seeing some increase in, at my agency, that can include even other agencies, of use of other methods like chat but that requires the ability to ABAC enable so that only the right individuals can be participants in that chat. And maybe that chat session is protected from those who cannot actually see it. So I'm not an expert in those technologies. I'm just saying that we have to skin some of these cats in another way. Email has been used and abused for a very long time, because for email SMIME specific to encryption, you're relying on other things. I need directories to publish the cert, the encryption cert to. I need to have, for ease of users to encrypt, you need the certificate information to go into the global address list that they use to identify the recipients of their email. And where you have multiple Active Directories and multiple directories among partnerships in a federation, that just doesn't always happen well.
And let me add on that, because it's a great question. The problem isn't the ICAM systems, I'll say that. It's the applications were designed with an internet mindset or a non-enterprise mindset, because when we come to work, we signed our lives away. So we know we're being monitored, but we want a single sign-on experience, not a specific protocol. I don't want to have to click all these stupid buttons like I do on the internet to log on with my Google address, my one I made up. And it's not an identity, it's my digital persona I want to present. Because I may be Alice when I'm on certain networks. They don't need to know that, but someone does so they can do appropriate CI investigations as needed. But the challenge is, how do you get the applications to assume that they're not system high, single focus? They're going to support users with multiple authentication approaches. They have to be ABAC enabled. They have to have smart tags. They have to be able to segment that data and protect it. And protect it for if they're running in this machine in this building and they're load balanced, unbeknownst to them, to some cloud somewhere else. That means they need to worry about at-rest encryption and things like that. We need to push, and we have been pushing for decades, the various vendors. And if things have improved, but they haven't improved fast enough. And so we'll go about PKI. We know not everybody does PKI on all three of the government networks and our mission partners, and they want to use different ways to authenticate users. Got it. We're starting to support those concepts now. Policy has changed, mission rules have changed, and we're getting smarter about it. We also know that we want to rehost applications from the real world, and several use OAuth, OpenID, OpenID Connect. So we're working on profiles to support that with different authentication methods. You go, oh, it's just a lift and shift. Well, sometimes the internet and commercial companies do stupid things. Oh, sorry, suboptimal things, which we may not want to do. And they were not designed for work as an enterprise. At one someone had mentioned bringing in these 5 applications, and they were going to say, well, you can just do it like on the internet. You put a Twitter button there, you put a Facebook button there, and the user can go click each time they use those apps. Our users that we deal with would revolt. They got rid of having 20 different user IDs and passwords for a couple of decades. They get a single sign-on experience. They're not going back. And that is a challenge because we did too good of a job from that point of view, I guess, and that we saved them time, we saved them money. They can focus on mission and not worrying about which icon should I click to log on with. They don't care about they do it at home, but at work, we're at work.
And there's a misinterpretation of that as well. There's a lot of people confuse single sign-on with security.
Yeah.
And that's what's one of the impacts that we have is that people in the social world, in industry, sometimes mistake that single sign-on is a security measure, but it's not.
Right.
It's actually a security risk. It means that they can use that single identity to log into multiple systems, but in fact what it means is that you know I have tied those multiple systems together through a single token sometimes, or multiple static passwords that's happening in the background. So there's a misconception that we always have to make sure that people understand that SSO is not security, and therefore the experience that they have in the in the outside and normal social media life and their personal lives should not be mistaken that they should have that same less risk experience in a corporate world or government.
But if we're doing certain missions, you know, humanitarian relief, and that NGO we're dealing with, all they got is a Gmail account, and people in advance said that's going to be good enough for that flyaway mission, that short-term temporal, then we have to support it. But we have to have oversight compliance lawyers, all those types of people to tell us that. IT can do wonderful things. IT can do stupid things. It's the stupid things that make us get nervous and could send us to jail. So we're trying not to do that. Sorry.
No, that's great. I wanted to kind of tease apart between you and between Joe and Roger about some of the security aspects or some of the security vulnerabilities that could potentially come up. Are there ways to mitigate some of those things as we go into this coalition partner environment? Because I think a single identity is great from an approach for a nation and all these stuff, and as we integrate together. But you kind of alluded that there's some security vulnerabilities with that. What are those? And then is there a way to mitigate some of that stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things I made a point earlier is that separation of where you've got somebody can bring their own identity and authenticate. But what I then do is they don't have access to nothing. It means they've just verified that they are who they are, where they're coming from, or what device they're on. The next phase is really separating, is kind of what Glenn was mentioning earlier and some of the things we talked about yesterday in the panel with Zero Trust. Then you separate the privilege access, and that's really where they can start to really make changes and use the applications. So what you're doing is you put a complete layer, and that privilege access can be multiple layers. It could be something that could be held within the nation state itself, and also held within the target where you're actually going to use the application or data from. And it means that both have a control over what authorization or what access they have to. And that means they have a bilateral trust control. So by separating identity, from the privileged access really allows you to move to a phase where you can actually start creating, I would call, dynamic trust. So some of the challenges that PKI has is that it's somewhat static for a period of time until you've identified you need to do something. Well, we need to move to much more of a dynamic trust model, meaning that it's continuous. That if something changes, that if all of a sudden tomorrow you're not having a good relationship with a certain state, that dynamic can automatically trigger and revoke those access through a privileged access approach. So it means that you can also apply where countries do not have the same security maturity, is that you can force and elevate that country's maturity to a standard of where you want it to be at. So privileged access can always bring, meaning that where what they're bringing may not have the right security controls or right capabilities, you can elevate that using privileged access.
Those are the challenges. We know our digital identities exist. Sometimes we'd like to alter them, but it's just your identity. It does not give you any permissions, attributes, entitlements, whichever words you prefer, to do certain things. When we're dealing with coalition partners, if they're sending us their identity and we're accepting their credential and everything and their identifiers, and they send us nationality example, we have to check to make sure what they're sending us seems to make sense. They shouldn't be, as an example, and it's only example only, they shouldn't be saying the person on the other end of the wire is a U.S. citizen, as an example. If we know there's no U.S. citizens embedded in there as a second-party integrity, as an example. So we do have to filter what they have, just on the off chance they unintentionally did it or some other reasons certain things are occurring. So we know what set of attributes we control, what set they control. We know we're passing certain ones. They may call nationality Fred as the variable name. We may call it country of affiliation. But on the transfer wire, we have an agreed to standard. So we can alter it as we need. And it goes back to, and then it goes to which protocols we're going to accept. Some protocols are better than others. At the Gartner conference last year in Las Vegas, for OAuth and all of that, the various representatives from financial community and stuff, they had been using bearer tokens for a long time. A bearer token is, if you remember the Die Hard movie, you know, Hans was still in bearer bonds. If you have the bond, you're that person. Well, bearer tokens are the same way in a digital world. I become the director. I'm not the director. But if I had his token, I would be the director and see everything that person would see. And they realized they needed to start phasing that out. Again, they had first generation concepts to do. They could handle it via insurance and other legal restrictions. And they're like, it's eating our lunch. Let's start phasing them out in the next few years and go to a different model. So some of us have been trying to help move some of these models around because it just depends. But we have to be flexible. The challenge for us is we have such a diverse environment, it depends on which specific mission we're talking about. Yet we have to build an IT system that we can rehost anywhere within so many minutes and be operational in so many hours because time is of the essence. And we have to be able to survive the attacks when they come.
I don't see any more questions. Oh,
I'll ask one. My name is Mark Douglas from Northrop Grumman. I'm going to take the conversation a little bit in a different direction. We've talked a lot about identity management and information access. When you get into a conflict or any type of an operation, assume for a minute that policy and identity management is solved. And you get in a situation where you have to plan, task, and execute operations across the operational area. Across the coalition as well as the joint forces. There's a big movement to go to some machine learning or artificial intelligence type stuff, but in today's world, that human is more knowledgeable than the computer because they have access to information that we can't get to the machine algorithm to be able to get the information. It doesn't matter how good the algorithm is, if it doesn't have all the relevant information, it's not going to get you what you need. So it's really a two-part question. One is how do we get to the point where we can take that information that should be available to that computer and get it to that computer so that you can use the algorithms to assist in that process. And the second part of the question is as you start to get that solved, how do you keep from getting to the point where the machine is smarter than the human, and there's actions that are taken that the human doesn't have full cognizance about what and why something is happening.
I've seen that movie and it doesn't end well.
Yeah. I can comment a bit on. I just came from a few weeks ago. I was at the Talent Digital Summit, where countries were establishing their AI strategies globally and sharing ideas and interconnections and discussion about what a lot of those meant. And one of the things is that I don't like the reference of artificial intelligence, the terminology of it. I think it's misrepresented, misinformed, and a lot of the industry misinform the community into what really artificial intelligence is. When you really break down, I prefer I'll kind of break it down from my view and then try to answer your question. The A is always misinterpreted. I've heard academics refer to it as artifact intelligence, meaning that it's all about gathering artifacts from other industries, augmented intelligence, because it's not there. It's there to provide automation, to provide humans the decision-making capabilities, so that helps us provide information to humans to decide on what needs to happen, rather than replacing humans. I've heard the use of automation, which I prefer to call it advanced automation or automation intelligence, meaning that what you're doing is you're taking something that humans would tend to take a long time to process or to calculate or to interpret, taking many, like hundreds of gigabytes of log files and trying to determine like one unusual behavior within that. For a human to do that, it will take a long time, but to do an automation would actually simplify. So in fact, what we've really been doing is we've been doing what I refer AI as machine intelligence. It's all about using intelligence of machines. And for me, we've been doing this for years. You know, we've been doing automation since the times were back when I was responsible for a data center and I had to reboot a machine. I automated that. I didn't have to go and do something like, was it sophisticated? I automated the task of doing that so that I wouldn't have to be spending the time doing it myself. So really what we're referring to is machine intelligence. It's actually the interpretation of machines being able to calculate either multiple sources of data and doing it at a faster pace that we can do based on algorithms that are there to specifically make those results or goals. So to do what you're doing is that machines will help us, and we have to continually provide input and context to the machines to continually learn based on our actions. So what you're going to do is that, yes, humans will have knowledge, but we will have to continually keep updating those algorithms and keep inputting data context for those machines to continually learn and do faster processing and faster compute to get to the goals. So I don't think that we're going to be able to solve that all of a sudden the computer's going to take out of our mind and be able to augment those algorithms for us. It's always going to be human interaction. So that's where data scientists and cognitive scientists will all come into important play in the future in our careers, is that they will be the ones that will help continually train the computers to do and help us automate a lot of those things, the challenges that we face. So hopefully that kind of gives you interpretation. So it's not going to be able to take it from, maybe someday we'll have MRI scanners that can read our brains and send what we're thinking, but that's probably a far way out. So it's important that it's continuous human interaction, bringing it into systems, algorithms will modify and learn based on that behavior, and therefore will continually be that human interaction continuously. So I prefer, machine intelligence is my preferred, is the interpretation.
Roger, do you have any?
I'm going to add to that every organization in a partnership, if they don't already have a chief data officer, this is a concept they need to. An organization that has data that is part of any kind of analytics program or something, they better understand the data they have, the data they're bringing, the data that's going to be processed by algorithms as part of analytics. I can't state that enough, because then your analytics are only as good as the richness of the data that's running through them. But when you start to mix data sets, they might be operating under different authorities. And what does it mean to mix these data sets? So this is where you really need to have staff from the organizations from whence the data comes that understands the data that's being processed through your analytics systems.
Yeah, absolutely. Context is key.
Can I follow up on that point real quick?
You can, but my knowledge in that area only goes so far.
No, I'm not an engineer. I come from an operator background. And I understand and I agree with what you're saying. That the challenge that the U.S. in particular has in that scenario is from what I'm hearing, each coalition would then have its own data scientists that would drive some of that information. And the problem from an acquisition standpoint is how do then the services go back and take that information from the chief scientist in PACOM and the chief scientist in UCOM, chief scientist in CENTCOM, and acquire a system that could operate in all of those environments. Unless you're saying that they should each have their separate acquisition channels, but then you also have the training problem of moving people back and forth. So I guess that's part of the challenge that the U.S. has about having to operate in multiple coalition environments and having to manage data sets that are separate and distinct from one to another.
Yeah, I don't know that I can answer that directly, but I do know that along with what I said also means understanding your data, you have to be able to label your data, and you better be able to have standards assigned to that, especially when you have multiple partners with their own data sets. You got to all be operating under the same kinds of standards for how you label data so that you can understand that data, and also so that data doesn't get lost.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that as well, it's all about context in the metadata as well. Is that one of the things is what we've done is go back to a little bit about the Estonia model. So in Estonia, we have different private and government institutions, and what they do is they publish not the data itself, and don't send the data and share the data with anyone else. What they do is they publish an index to what data they have capability of providing. So they publish, let's say, a library index. Here's the information I have, and they might provide some additional context to that. So what we're doing is they're sharing what types of data that they're storing and they have collected, and then others can make requests for actually access to that. So it's a better way than trying to just aggregate and correlate data just for the sake of it. It really means that you want to have, I always go back to always asking the right questions, and then the questions will lead me to where those data locations are, and then going through the right authority channels in order to request either temporary aggregation of that data or that I can get the data correlated and brought back to me. So that's where you can actually work in a multi-data source environment, is if I know I don't need all the data and all the access. What I do is I need to know what type of data they have, and then allow that to be aggregated on demand if you need to. So metadata and context is what makes data valuable. Not tons of data, because tons of data just sometimes means that you're looking for a needle in a haystack. You want to get more needles rather than more hay. So context is king when it comes to data.
I'd like to add to Joe and Ian's comments on this one. So I know the United States has been working diligently since the DoD took over implementing the National Information Exchange Model to provide that basically semantic references between nations to be able to support information exchange, so that when someone says first name, it actually references to the given name on other nations and how they interpret things, so that we all talk about the same way, and then we understand what formats are actually being used in that type of thing. So there's work going on in that process to understand from a modeling standpoint that the data that might be coming out of the United States comes out this way, here's the standard, but what does that really mean? Because sometimes we use different words for a lot of those things, and including when we started preparing for this panel, we started talking right past each other on certain aspects because we just didn't have that context that went through it.
But I want to, you brought up something important, but one's diverging for a second. The work, when you're dealing with partners, some of us deal with partners, and we're joint teams, and that's the important thing. The spelling of authorization is an example. So some of us, to try and make everybody nice, in a document you may spell the word 50% one way, 50% the other way. So when it goes through the governance processes of two different organizations, you get yelled at only 50% of the time, not 100% of the time. But the IT people, we get along. But you brought up licenses. That is something we haven't talked about, which is something that we have to be very careful. Whatever technology we do, when we go and procure a capability, a lot of the licenses that vendors have are 19th century based. in that they still think you're going to self-contain everybody in a directory, an example. If you're dealing with coalitions and you're doing on-demand user access, you don't know how many users are coming, they're like, well, if you're dealing with the internet, well, you need to plan for X billion of people. That is suboptimal. I cannot afford that. So you have to ensure you write terms and conditions and negotiate where you have great flexibility. Vendors do not like that. A large multinational company operates in the major sectors of the world. If they're trying to sell their product to your Five Eyes partners, as an example, you find out each one has different terms and conditions. For some of us, we have to remind ourselves, one of the problems that you run into is that culture, and that salesperson for that region of the world only makes money if they do the sale. They can't do a single sale to 5 organizations because they each want to make their own profit. Isn't it a bad thing? It's just a fact. But when you go into write your negotiations, you have to figure out how to do those terms and conditions smartly. So I don't all of a sudden get hit with a large bill that you can never pay. Or the worst case is you find out that the product has a kill switch in it when it exceeds by so much what they thought the license was, and they never told you, even though the government contract says you shall never stop, because the government does not always pay their bill on time for various reasons, or we're in an active conflict. That one's are fun.
So with that, we're coming to the conclusion of the panel session. I have one question for the panelists. Roger, you alluded to this actually really well, so it's a good lead-in. I'm looking at, from an industry or government standpoint, what are the next steps? How do we engage either industry, government, to support federation, and especially in coalition interoperability, but federation in general? What are those next steps that we can look at? So I'll start with Ian.
Okay, this may, I think Roger alluded to it earlier, but we've all been, we all do certificates. Policy is stated forever, thou shalt use a certificate to authenticate. Well, that model is going to be changing. Yeah, Roger, I know you brought it up, but we cannot adopt a model where anyone can just bring their own authenticator, because at the end of the day, an application can only be configured to do so much. You don't want to force that kind of agility and flexibility on applications. We have to abstract authentication away from applications. So that's why we're talking these other token models, be it, be it SAML, OIDC, or so forth. Anything to abstract away directly from applications will be a helpful model that we have to pursue. And where there's policy that makes statements that, whether by interpretation or explicit wording, does not permit that, we have to assess those for being modernized.
Okay, so I mean, the world is getting even more connected as we go out there, and everything out there, from a hardware to some of the different things, there has some type of spectrum dependency on it. So the ability to cooperate and collaborate as you move from one space to another is hugely important. So when you're going out and procuring hardware or anything of that nature, you have to have an understanding that that hardware needs to be able to work in multiple environments. So if you're only keeping it US focused, then from an operational standpoint, it will diminish our capabilities as we move forward. Even from a cooperation standpoint, moving to other nations. So I would say look at that, have a look at that, and just understanding that even these light bulbs are emanating things, and there's lots of different things we can do and others can do from an operational standpoint. So we have to be cognizant that as we move to a cloud, understand that cloud touches something, and that's what that something is emanating. So it's hugely important to keep that in your perspective.
Thank you.
If you're a procurator system, or if you're the data owner, oversight and compliance, or whatever, if you cannot write down what you think your access control rules, your release rules are, shame on you. And you have to think of all possible conditions. Do you want Colonel Genovi to be able to access that from the Starbucks in North Korea, even though he's a U.S. citizen, operating from a U.S. device and all of that? Would you still want him to read the lunch menu from Camp Smith? Don't know, but you have to think about some of those conditions. all the attributes would be perfect, but maybe they're just, all of a sudden you go, from that location? No. Commercial businesses do it, but they face a different problem. They're looking at fraud. We bring in fraud detection techniques to help us, but if you can't write down what you think you want your rules to be, us IT people have challenges helping. I'm an IT person, I'm an exploit person, I've learned a lot about terms and conditions, more than I ever expected to over my career now. But it all boils down to that. I can tell you standards on how to smart tag stuff. I can tell you how we can authenticate. I can tell you how we can't do certain things you want to do. But if you don't help us understand what you're trying to do, we won't be as successful as we need to be.
Excellent. I think really kind of progressing and moving forward, I think one of the most critical and vital things to make all this come together is that we need to do a risk model, a risk framework that allows us to identify what priorities we need to do first. I've always been kind of going through, every time in my entire career, I always have to prioritize what I do each day to be effective and to be contributing as much as I possibly can. And I do that by evaluating the risks. And these risks can be based on different maturities and different models and different relationships. But what I put up right up there is that the risks that I fear the most are the ones I actually put my focus into. In order for you to do things or make action or make progress, you must fear the consequences. And therefore, a risk framework is only possible to make all of these possible by actually fearing those risks. And those are the ones you should prioritize. Those are the ones that make a difference. And those are the ones that make the most progress. So to move forward, all of this must be within a risk model that allows you to make sure you prioritize on the right risks in the right areas first.
Can I say just one more thing? Who's with me? I've heard enough about Estonia in the last couple days that don't tell my wife I'm not flying home to Maryland. I'm emigrating directly to Estonia. Who's with me?
You're most welcome. I'll be happy to come visit. I'll give you a great tour. So, apparently, I'm one of the great was it tourist advisors for Estonia for all the conferences I attend.
That's great. Thank you very much. As a panel, please give a round of applause to our panelists. I hope you found this very valuable on this aspect. And both Ian and Roger will be talking later today on identity management, and several processes. And then Colonel McCloud will be talking about the electromagnetic spectrum later this afternoon as well. So I hope you could stick around for those presentations and enjoy the rest of your rest of the forum. Excuse me.